former deputy Israeli ambassador to Egypt and an Arab affairs expert. Ruth, thank you so much, as always, for being here.
My pleasure.
So Egypt has emerged as the main mediator in the ceasefire deal. To start, give us your thoughts on the longevity of this truce, so to speak. How long do you think it is going to remain in place?
You asked me a question that is very difficult to answer very absolutely correctly. Egypt has always been, let's say, for the past several years, the mediator, as it has a very big stake in the stability of the region, sharing a border together with the Gaza Strip, and not wanting the instability to seep into its own borders. But also it does have some leverage over the Hamas, allowing it entrance into Egypt at some points and so on. Regarding the time, I think it's not a matter of the negotiation and the mediation, but rather the hits that Hamas had because of the IDF attacks and defense. The IDF has strongly hit, first of all, the underground terror tunnels that have been built by the head of the military wing of the Hamas, Def, and he wanted to have a kind of an underground city in which to train, from which to attack Israeli towns on the border of Gaza and Israel, and also in which to maneuver with weapons. And that was destroyed by the IDF. This is something that has long-term repercussions in terms of coming back to its own force, as well as other IDF, let's say, successes. But that's on the military front. I think that the fighting, which was initiated by Hamas, if I remind the audience, was not about the Gaza Strip this time, and declaratively they said this is about representing the whole of the Palestinian people. So their fight was not only military. The rockets that were thrown were not only military oriented, but they wanted to engineer a kind of a perception amidst the Palestinians throughout, including the West Bank. I remind the audience, the hatred, not less, between the Hamas and the Fatah in the West Bank, wanting to, let's say, really incite the Palestinians in the West Bank in order to fight the Fatah and fight Israel. So in other words, to really make the stability and the quiet that we've had disappear. Similarly, actually, to take the Arab Israelis or the Palestinians of Israeli citizenship and to have them uprise against the Israeli citizens of Jewish origin and the government. And that is a whole different story, Benita.
So to that exact point, we know, for example, Antony Blinken is going to go and try and solidify the ceasefire, in his words, in Jerusalem, Ramallah, Cairo and Amman. But you're talking about flare-ups locally right now on the streets of this region. Exactly. Who is responsible for quelling those tensions right now?
So everything that is happening within Israel, of course, the responsibility clearly is the Israeli government. A lot of citizens, both Jewish and Arab, have taken upon themselves also to stand up against the hatred, to demonstrate and so on. And yet, the tensions are there. The trauma that many Jewish inhabitants and citizens have experienced, for instance, in Lod, is not going to go away in an instant. The trust that was in essence and inherently delicate to begin with, but existing for 73 years despite everything, was hurt. And a lot of work will need to be done on rebuilding the trust and really working on the issue of inclusion, the feeling of inclusion, and for infrastructure, and quelling the violence and the crime on the Arab street that have really risen in the past 10 years. This is something I've written about and talked about again and again. Illegal holding of weapons by Arab citizens, of course not all of them, but The violence and the crime that we have witnessed on the Arab street is something that can no longer be sustained and has seeped into what we see as nationalistic acts against Jewish citizens.
You certainly are describing a very worrying situation, and as you say, trust on all sides is something that is going to have to be focused on for leaders across the board. Ruth Wasserman Lande, thank you as always for your insight and your time. We always appreciate your input. Thank you. Well, we're taking a very short break now. When we get back, Yair Lapid and his Yesh Atid